So hello everyone. Thank you, Chrissy and Daniel, for your very interesting and important talk. I'm Flip Jansen from Bundesverband Trans, the Federal Trans Association in Germany, an NGO and umbrella organization fighting for the rights and the empowerment of trans people and people identifying outside the binary gender system. I prefer she, her pronouns. And I will talk about the ethical problems of collecting data on gender and sexuality and make some suggestions based on best practices. Also, I'm studying IT and had some experiences with the difficulty of data handling, so I will try to talk about these problems too. First, I will talk about some definitions and how to address people, then talk about the history of collecting data on sexuality in Germany, and which conclusions can be drawn from that. With this in mind, I will focus on the question, what are useful fields of collected data on sexuality and gender, and why collect this data at all? In the last two sections, I will tell you about the best practices and my suggestions for collecting and presenting the data. But first, some definitions. I brought you this gender unicorn from Trans Student Educational Resources. So when I speak about gender or gender identity, I speak about how someone identifies themselves. If it matches the sex assigned at birth, I speak about cisgender or cis people, in distinction to interpersons, transgender, non-binary, agender, gender fluid, and more. Maybe some of you know already the German category diverse, so I will give later some background information. As you can see, the sketch differentiates also the gender expression and to whom you are sexually or romantically attracted. It is important to understand the difference between gender and sexuality, as there is sometimes this misconception that trans and inter has something to do with sexuality. There are heterosexual trans persons, but also lesbian trans women or pansexual inter or asexual cis men. So you can't determine sexuality by gender or the other way around. Keyword diverse. The campaign for a third option was supported by trans, inter, and queer people and fought for the introduction of a third gender marker in German passports, birth certificates, and other legal documents. In 2017, the Federal Constitutional Court ruled that the existing regulation on binary gender options in the birth registry is unconstitutional. As a result, the German Civil Status Act was changed to allow as a positive third option diverse in 2018, and also the option to leave the gender marker open as an adult, which was only possible for children before. But contrary to the idea of the campaign, the diverse registration is not open for all, but only for persons with medically approved variants in sex characteristics. However, this fight is not over yet. Trans and inter can be men, can be women between or outside the gender binary, like non-binary persons. Important is how they identify. So it's necessary to not assume the gender of the person you are seeing. I recommend to tell them what your preferred pronouns are for them to address you, and ask them what pronouns they prefer to be addressed by you. You can just ask, for example, what gender pronouns do you use? Personally, I identify as a non-binary trans feminine person, and I prefer she, her pronouns. If you had no opportunity to ask, you can just use non-gendered pronouns, which is easier in English, but by using they, them. In the German language, I often use only the name of the person. But there are a lot of pronouns, for example, sie, xie, hen, per, and others. So if you create a questionnaire for collecting data, it is important to use gender-neutral, inclusive language in every question, not only when collecting gender and sexuality. Unfortunately, in contrast to English language, in German language, every noun, every adjective needs to be gender inflected. For example, if you want to ask about experience of people who sell something, a neutral approach would be to avoid gender nouns, like salesman, or in German Verkäufer, but to use neutral descriptions like salesperson. In German, it's more complicated. You can sometimes build participle constructions like verkaufende, but it only helps in a plural form. Sometimes you can paraphrase it, du als Teil des Verkaufspersonals, you as a part of the sales team. If this sounds too complicated, you can use VerkäuferInnen, which can replace the including so-called generic masculine form. And yes, IT people know the asterisk as a placeholder. Here it stands for the diversity of genders. Alternatively, you can use underscores. Sometimes people use a colon, as screen readers will be reading it with a small pause. But gender inclusive language is a topic for itself, so if you want to know more, we can talk later about it. So now a little bit of history. In Germany, there is this painful tradition of compiling lists of people. Homosexual acts between males were criminalized by paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code from 1872. In order to persecute these acts, the police investigated thoroughly the scene of homosexuals and compiled a list of homosexual suspects, later known as Rosa Liste, pink list. Hundreds were convicted as homosexual men. Reading some of the biographies, we can see that also trans and non-binary people were targets. In 1935, in the beginning of National Socialism, the paragraph was even broadened so that more people were affected and the law was tightened. The lists were a help to send 10,000 to concentration camps. There's this common estimation that more than half of them were killed in the camps. After the liberation, the lists were continued by the West German police based on the tightened paragraph of the National Socialism, leading still to convictions of thousands every year. Although in 1969 homosexual acts between adults were not persecuted anymore, this paragraph was not abolished until 1994. In 2002, Nazi-era convictions of this paragraph were annulled, but only in 2017, all convictions in West Germany were annulled and small reparations were granted in most of the cases. But the police of Bavaria and Thuringia used until 2005 a software that allowed places and persons to be listed under the keyword homosex and had blocked these options only after massive protests. So especially with the rise of the far right, collecting data on sexuality is a very sensitive topic. Protection of the collected data is therefore essential. It makes sense to use anonymization where it is possible and pseudonymization from the very beginning of collecting data. People want to decide for themselves who knows what about their sexuality and also if they are trans, inter, or non-binary. In fact, a lot of trans persons want to live as men or women without their neighbors knowing about them being trans. But in the right context, it may be very important for them to be visible as trans. For example, when we want to collect data about special needs of trans persons. So you need to remind yourself when pointing out genders connected to locations. Maybe a trans woman in a small village is likely to be de-anonymized. So why collect data on sexuality and gender at all? Is it a boy or a girl? Every form you have to fill out at the doctors, at the administration, when online shopping, there are questions about your gender, mostly binary gender. The world seems to stand still if we don't know if you're M or F. First, you have to ask yourself, why do I need to collect data on gender or sexuality? Is it really necessary? Or do I only include the question because it's common to do so? Second, what is the gender-related or sexuality-related question you want to answer? There can be good reasons to collect data on gender and sexuality, but it is important to reflect on the power relations. For example, it's important to have data on the living situation of trans persons. Dan, you already talked about it. Keep in mind that discrimination and privilege is determined not only by one factor, for example, sexuality, but a combination of a person's social identities, which are intertwined and can produce new forms of inequalities. Black feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw called this intersectionality. For example, a black trans woman has other experiences than a white trans woman, but also other experiences as a black cis woman. The discriminations don't add up, but create a new form of discrimination. The way you ask, the way you collect the data is never completely impartial. You have certain ideas of how things are or should be, and you need to reflect on them in order to get results that are not reinforcing stereotypes. Though the effort census focuses on another power relation, it is a good example on how community-based data projects can support political action and empowerment, because it will provide data for political arguments. For trans people in particular, there's not a lot of data, especially in Germany. We can't even say how many trans persons are unemployed. So how to collect? As I said before, there's a variety in gender and in sexuality, which is difficult to put into boxes. I know that data scientists want to have clear categories, reduce complexity, draw fancy bar charts, pie charts, etc., or do some machine learning magic. On the other hand, you want to include people and want them to be open for the rest of your questionnaire. If someone sees that they are not represented in the questionnaire, it's likely that they are not interested in answering the rest of the questionnaire. So the easiest way to collect gender identity would be to create only 5 boxes for female, male, diverse, non-binary, no gender marker, and I don't want to say as a default option. By the way, I've seen this a lot of times. Please never use radio buttons with men as default. You don't want to give people the feeling that having a gender other than male needs to be more work. With these 5 suggested boxes, you can be sure that there are still a lot of people who don't feel represented by these options. So you can try to create a lot of boxes to choose from. There's a dating platform that has 22 options, and still you won't have boxes for everyone. What I suggest from a diversity perspective is to create a free text field for gender and also one for sexuality. From a data science perspective, I know about the difficulties in the implementation. You might need to write a parser to find the most common ones, including spelling mistakes, and also maybe someone from the LGBTQIA community needs to sort and spell correct the ones which are not common. But it's worth it because it will include all genders and all sexualities, and we might learn something new. Depending on your question, it can be important to know if people have a trans or inter history, or if they identify as binary gender and also identify as trans or inter. For example, if you want to ask about discriminations related to gender. So you might solve this in this version with a gender boxed questionnaire by allowing to click more than one gender box, or you need to ask this separately. But when asking, it can be problematic to ask for deviance to the norm, as it amplifies that norm and might even pathologize who is not fitting into this norm. So try to ask in a general way so that everyone feels welcomed. Including someone from the community in modeling the research process would make sense either way. So how to present? Now we have a lot of categories collected and we need to present our results. Remember, only show gender, sexuality if you really think it is necessary to answer a gender-related or sexuality-related question and it reflects on power relations. It is very important to make sexualities and genders outside the cis-hetero norm visible, and so it is good to show the variety of participating people and their genders and sexualities. But when we talk about absolute numbers, sometimes we will have only a few people in each category. So firstly, the danger of de-anonymization increases. Secondly, the representativity is very low. So if you want to ask, for example, about unemployed genderqueers in comparison to unemployed women, unemployment of genderqueers can be extreme due to the small sample size. So unfortunately, in the end, you might be forced to reduce complexity by combining gender identities or sexualities. For gender-related questions, I already talked about these minimum 5 categories. I don't want to say, no gender marker, diverse, non-binary, female, male, but feel free to add some of the more common ones. Similar with sexuality. My suggestion would be to use at least 6 categories: bisexual, queer, heterosexual, homosexual, asexual, and I don't want to say. Important is to avoid placing the norm as first. It is good to change the order of genders or sexualities in different charts. And I'm sure you have other more creative ideas for visualization besides the usual charts, which can answer your research question on the one hand by also showing the diversity of genders and sexualities on the other hand. So thank you for listening, and I think this will be enough input for now. If you have questions, please ask.